Hi guys, welcome back to the Night of the Rabbit. I've got a bit of a headache, so I'm going to record Mousewood Stories 4 and 5, mute my mic, and, I don't know, go have a smoke or something. By the time I get back, it will probably be nowhere near done. So, here you go.
Fourth story, Mr. Brown and the Curious Case of the Reliable Hedgehog Brothers. It was a dull, windy day when Mr. Brown the mouse arrived. Only rarely did the sun poke through the heavy shroud of grey clouds over Mousewood. It had been days since Mr. Brown left his hometown, sleeping at different boarding houses and inns on the way. The further away he got from familiar territory, the more he felt it all becoming a fully fledged adventure. It was this desire for adventure that had, over the years, driven him to go on long journeys. This time it had been an invitation from his good friend Rushlight that encouraged him to take to the road again. Mr. Brown had met Rushlight on one of his journeys a few years back, and they had been friends ever since. In his letter, Mr. Brown's acquaintance invited him to visit Mousewood. This was where Rushlight had withdrawn to some 2 months previously, in order to write poetry and read some of his more demanding books in the calm and tranquil ambience that the forest offered. For a hasty observer, it would have been easy to overlook Mr. Brown as he passed through Mousewood. The chubby little mouse had always been an inconspicuous fellow. A skilled observer, however, would have noticed a certain insecurity in Mr. Brown since entering the forest. He seemed to have problems getting around roots, sticks, and stones, as these are rarely to be found in towns and cities. So Mr. Brown was preoccupied, holding his fedora firmly on his head to stop it falling off, while in his other hand he carried a big case. Despite this challenge, the mouse was actively enjoying roaming around this new territory. Between Mr. Brown's pink ears dwelt a lucid mind, which often proved helpful to his fellow mice, especially when complex tasks or tricky puzzles were involved. Following the directions Rushlight had given him, after turning left at the big birch and then going straight on, Mr. Brown reached his acquaintance's house. From a distance he could already see him in the front garden, sitting in a deck chair reading a book. Rushlight was a mouse of stalwart physique, who wasn't only tall, but also made a tall impression on everyone who didn't match his height. Mr. Brown hardly ever made a tall impression on anyone, at least not through his physique, since, even for a mouse, he seemed a little on the short side. Mr. Brown crept up and startled his friend by patting him on the shoulder. Rushlight sprung up from his chair and, recognizing his guest, exclaimed loudly, "My dear friend," and gave him a literally breathtaking hug. "You've made yourself at home, I see," said Mr. Brown, readjusting his hat. "Indeed, this really is the place to be," Rushlight said, spreading out his arms and taking a deep breath. "A couple of weeks in Mousewood will drive the city's grime and noise out of your head, I promise you." "Seems like it's done you lots of good already. You almost squashed me," Mr. Brown remarked with a smile. "Well, it's a great pleasure to see you again," said Rushlight. "Can I offer you a drink?" "What kind of a guest would I be," his inconspicuous friend replied, "if I rejected such an offer?" "Still very much yourself, I see," said Rushlight with a laugh, and offered his friend a seat. Then he disappeared into the house. Mr. Brown sat down and carefully placed his case next to his chair on the forest floor. He relished the moment and looked up, finding the magnificent treetops much more beautiful than the buildings he was used to that filled the city's skies. Moments later, Rushlight returned with glasses and a jug. "It's an uncanny coincidence," said Rushlight, and poured Mr. Brown some lemonade. "But only yesterday I heard about a case that might interest you." Mr. Brown took a sip of his drink and listened to what his host had to tell him. "Over the last couple of weeks I've been taking long walks through the neighborhood. Roaming the forest after months of dull city life changes you completely. Your spirits, said Rushlight, beating his chest, return, and you're full of zest. So it was that yesterday I came across a house where a group of animals had gathered. Said house was a beautiful wooden construction, artfully crafted onto a tree trunk. As I found out later, the inhabitants had built it themselves. 2 hedgehogs, with the reputation of being excellent craftsmen. When you see the house, you'll agree that they deserve all the praise they get. Anyway, to find out what the animals were discussing so passionately, I addressed a beaver standing nearby. He explained that the previous night, the Hedgehog brothers, who own the house and the workshop behind it, had been the victims of burglars. It seems that both their tools and the materials they'd been working with were stolen when they left them in the back garden. Apparently not even a tranquil, idyllic place like this is safe from thieves and their kind, concluded Rushlight. Mr. Brown listened attentively, looking into his glass that had now been reduced to 1/3 full. Maybe you're right, dear friend, he said, but we shouldn't be too hasty to call this theft. Rushlight refilled his glass as a magpie chattered above, spying on them. What makes you think this could be anything other than the work of a common thief? Asked Rushlight, intrigued by the thought. Well, according to your account, not only tools but also materials went missing. A thief only after things of certain value would have taken the tools but discarded the cheaper materials. In this respect, I think, local burglars wouldn't differ from their city cousins. You're right, agreed Rushlight, but the question remains as to who stole the tools and materials, and for what reason. Determined to solve the mystery, Mr. Brown and Rushlight decided to pay the Hedgehog brothers a visit. If this wasn't the work of a common thief, maybe they would find some clue as to the culprit. After finishing the lemonade, Mr. Brown put his case inside the house, but took his umbrella, as heavy rain was forecast for Mousewood any time today. The 2 friends were in luck, and the rain held off. The ground, however, was still soaking wet with the rain of recent days. Whenever they encountered miry passages, Rushlight got through without difficulty, and Mr. Brown appreciated the fact his umbrella could also serve as a walking stick. Accompanied by the scent of earth and moss, the 2 mice walked along the path. The Hedgehog brothers' house was located a few paces from the edge of the forest, and was indeed a remarkable building. It wasn't enormous, not like a castle, but was of modest proportions, built in several layers and stories around the tree trunk. As the pair was looking at the Hedgehog brothers' house from the path, a lizard with a slouch hat emerged from the house next door and joined them. "You want to visit the hedgehogs?" the lizard asked. "Yes, indeed," said Mr. Brown. "Is that their house over there?" "It is, and if I'm not mistaken, they've just had visitors. You should probably go over. It certainly looks like rain," the lizard said, pulling his hat a little deeper over his face. "Are you acquainted with the Hedgehog brothers?" asked Rushlight, leaning on the fence. "Yep, for ages, I might add. They're good neighbours, as everyone will tell you. Both of them are happy to do simple jobs for free, and they're reliable. The only thing is, the noise from all the hammering and sawing is unbearable," the lizard said with a rueful smile. "Yesterday was the first day in weeks I was able to take a nap in the afternoon." "I heard the hedgehog's tools were stolen. That's probably why they couldn't disturb your nap, isn't it?" Rushlight asked. "That's the case. Yesterday morning they were gone," replied the lizard. "Despite the fact that burglary is a very rare occurrence in these parts, you know." The lizard took his leave and went off towards Meadow Pond. Mr. Brown scratched his head, while Rushlight opened the gate leading to the hedgehog's home. Just as the visitors were about to knock at the door, it opened. The Hedgehog brothers were just taking their leave of guests, a lumpy mole lady and her smaller husband, who both wore thick glasses. Mr. Brown and Rushlight stepped aside to let the moles make their exit. "Mr. Rushlight, a pleasure meeting you again," said the corpulent mole lady with a smile. Rushlight, quite the gentleman and a chip off the old block, bowed politely. "How do you know my wife?" asked the male mole, looking reproachfully at Rushlight through his thick spectacles. "Why, Ludwig," his wife exclaimed, dismayed. "We met this nice gentleman at the garden party near Marigold Meadows. He's from the city. He's here on holiday." The mole helplessly hung his head. "Well, I joined you quite late, so it's not surprising you don't remember me," Rushlight tried to help. "Please excuse my inadvertence anyway," replied the short-sighted mole, looking at Mr. Brown in a disoriented fashion. The latter was so amused he completely forgot to introduce himself. "How can I help?" asked one of the Hedgehog brothers. "We were hoping to discuss the disappearance of your tools with you," said Rushlight in a serious tone. The Hedgehog brothers nodded. Every bit of help was much appreciated, since this was already their second day without tools, the second day without work. "You heard about that too?" asked the mole lady, genuinely upset. "Someone took their tools in the middle of the night. They're the most reliable carpenters you'll find. They never forget anything nor leave work undone. And now their tools are gone. And that's not the worst of it. They were working on a new desk for my husband. Ludwig so enjoys writing letters. We'd almost finished the lady's commission, and suddenly our tools and cuts disappeared," sighed the hedgehog with the red dungarees. His brother in the blue dungarees blew his nose loudly into a large handkerchief. Mr. Brown looked at him with interest. The hedgehog blew his nose again and muttered hoarsely, "It's sad that our tools are gone, sure, but I've caught a cold and I've got a temperature." He coughed. Then he coughed again. "Please let us know as soon as you get your tools back," said the mole lady before saying goodbye. "But Lottie, the old desk will do just fine," said her husband as they left the hedgehog's yard, looking up at her insecurely. "And I haven't actually written any letters for quite a while." "I know," she replied, "but just wait till you sit at your new desk. You won't be able to stop writing." The mole sighed quietly. The Hedgehog brothers led Mr. Brown and Rushlight around to their workshop behind the house. "Everything's just like it was the evening before we were burgled," the hedgehog in the red dungarees said. His brother stood a few paces away, giving his cold his full attention. "So you left your tools and the parts for the desk out here when you finished work for the day?" Rushlight asked. "Yep," said the hedgehog, looking around the workshop. It was empty, save for some sawdust on the grass. Mr. Brown looked up to the sky, his gaze following the shifting clouds. "Do you always leave your equipment out in the open like that?" he asked. "No. Usually we put our tools, materials and the like in that store over there. Not because of thieves, but because of the weather, you see. Tools need to be kept dry," the hedgehog explained. "Then why would you have left your gear outside in this weather?" the short mouse asked, lifting his fedora to scratch his head. The ill hedgehog let out a hacking cough. "He forgot." His brother rolled his eyes as if he had already heard the accusation 100 times. "Usually my brother takes care of these things because I'm absent-minded," he admitted. "In contrast to me, he's quite reliable, but as you can see, he's ill. As he's got this nasty fever, he went to bed early that evening, and I didn't think of putting our gear in the store. Strange thing if you think about it. The first time we forget to put our stuff away, someone steals everything." Mr. Brown took a good look around the yard. "Tell me, what do you use these other stores for, next to the one where you store your tools?" he asked. "Jars," the hedgehog replied. "We restock our supply a few months before winter and then lock the shelters. It's a long time since anybody's been in them. Luckily, the thief didn't break in there." "Indeed. Seems like a remarkable coincidence, some scoundrel picking precisely that evening to go off with your tools," said Rushlight. "Don't forget the materials. What would a thief do with the parts of a half-finished desk?" Mr. Brown pointed out. "Perhaps we're dealing with an inexperienced thief," the hedgehog suggested. He just grabbed everything he could in a rush. Things rarely get stolen around here, so a lack of experience could explain that, don't you think? But a nervous thief would be in a rush. He'd sooner grab something more valuable than your boards. I'm convinced our thief took the materials on purpose. He must have had some special interest in those desk parts and your work, Mr. Brown concluded. The brothers suggested a cup of tea. The ill hedgehog led the way to the living room, staggering slightly from time to time. He seemed a bit dizzy. After going to the kitchen, he returned shortly afterwards and slumped into an armchair. Then he closed his weary eyes, swaying back and forth. "You should get some rest," Rushlight said in a worried voice. The hedgehog opened his eyes again, giving him a fatigued blink. "I suppose you're right," he said, and then turned to his brother. "You heard him. Would you care to put the kettle on?" His brother stood up with a smile and went into the kitchen. When Mr. Brown asked about cups, the hedgehog pointed out a cupboard from his armchair. Mr. Brown put 4 cups and saucers on the table. Then he sat back on the couch, which wasn't all that comfortable, since, for obvious reasons, the hedgehog brothers had no cushions. A few minutes later, the other hedgehog returned from the kitchen. "You'd already put some water on to boil," he said to his brother. "Had I?" he replied. "Well, so much the better." The hedgehog poured the tea for his guests and his sick brother, a tasty wild briar tea. "Our forest's famous for this," he informed the tourists. If he hadn't been saddened by the loss of his tools, he would probably have added a chuckle. But the brothers found this was no time for joviality. They did nevertheless talk to their guests about the forest, the town, and other things. As the ill hedgehog brother reached for his tea and took a careful sip, his brother said, "That's my cup." The sick hedgehog took a closer look. "Right," he said. "Sorry." Mr. Brown smiled. "Might I have a look at the key you used to lock up your store?" he asked humbly. Puzzled, the hedgehog brothers looked at each other. What could the mouse possibly want their key for? The ill hedgehog pulled the keychain out of his pocket and handed it over to the still smiling Mr. Brown, who examined it closely. "Am I right in assuming that these keys fit the locks on the other storerooms, where your supplies are stored?" he asked. "Yeah, that's right," the fit hedgehog confirmed. Mr. Brown went to the living room window and looked into the yard where the storeroom stood. "I think I may have just solved this puzzling case," he said. Rushlight and the hedgehogs were astonished when Mr. Brown suggested going out to the yard. Only the ill hedgehog stayed in the living room and watched them through the open window. "This is a good example of how even the trickiest cases can be solved over a nice cup of tea," said Mr. Brown. Up in the trees a few sparrows chirped. "Then who is the thief?" Rushlight asked impatiently. "There is no thief," Mr. Brown answered, "and there has been no theft." "But our stuff disappeared," the hedgehog said. "That is beyond doubt." "You're right, of course. So it's time to make it reappear," suggested Mr. Brown, and walked over to one of the stores where the jars for the coming winter were kept. He unlocked the door with one of the keys on the keychain and pulled it open. Between jerky and jarred fruit lay the half-finished parts of the desk and the tools. In fact, everything missing since yesterday morning. Rushlight was speechless, as was the hedgehog. "How did they get in here?" he asked in amazement. "Your brother did not, in fact, forget to clear up the workshop and your equipment," Mr. Brown explained. "After you finished work, he got up again, went to the yard, and, as reliably as always, put the material into the store. But just as he confused the teacups due to his fever, he also confused the stores. His tracks are clearly visible in the mud if you look out of the window, despite the fact that nobody has been there for weeks. When he had finished storing everything, he locked the door again and forgot he'd ever been there, just as he forgot he'd already boiled the water for our tea. That's why he was as puzzled as everyone else about the disappearance of your tools. Things like this happen when you're running a fever, Mr. Brown concluded. Rushlight slapped him on the back and exclaimed, "What a reliable fellow! He never forgets anything. Sometimes he just can't remember not forgetting." The hedgehog took a hammer out of the shelter, walked to the workshop, and, hiding the hammer behind his back, waved to his brother. "So, what's the news?" the sick hedgehog at the window asked. His brother produced the hammer. "Where'd you find that?" his brother asked, in as much amazement as his sore throat and dizziness would allow. The other hedgehog pointed at the store behind him. "Right where you put it, brother," he said, laughing. "Me?" the other brother asked, thinking hard. "Really? Well, okay." No one took his mistake amiss. If anything, he had once again proved his reliability. And you can't blame somebody for having a cold, now can you? Later, on their way home, Mr. Brown and his friend Rushlight took the time to enjoy the countryside before returning to the forest. Here, on the elevated northern edge of the woods, one could look far into the distance across the fields. The wind hustled big piles of grey clouds through the sky, which, where the sun managed to pierce the thick shroud, cast huge scudding shadows on the fields beneath. Fifths.
Fuck it, I'm getting bored. What the hell was I doing?
Woohoo! Hello, Jenny. Well, where to? Let's go. Hang on tight, Jenny. See you later.
That's a really good idea, but I can't reach it.
For fuck's sake.
A stick won't help here. Here we go. I'm not strong enough to pull that branch down. That's it, really, but I can't. No. Now what? That good. I can see the waterfall up. Now what? I'll toss this end of the shoelace through the window. Now? An interesting thought. I just hope this won't backfire, or the dwarves may lock me up in the tunnel after all. I'd say that worked pretty well. Neither the spider web nor the branch is sticky enough to fasten it there.
Okay.
No, I'll keep. No, I'll... No, I'll...
Looks like we'll have to get our mosquito.
I have to be...
See you soon. And remember, swap mole, and mole.
I wrote down some jokes from Jonathan Squirrel. I made a special note of it.
Fire away.
Why do bees hum?
Obviously, dear listeners, because they can't remember the words.
Why do mice usually avoid drinking too much blue juice?
For the same reason as me, because the hangover gives them the blues.
I don't quite get that one. A rabbit couple is booked on a luxury cruise. At the quay they get stopped because there are too many of them. Why?
Because with rabbits, two is a crowd.
I don't get that one either.
But the audience loves it. You could be a really good co-host.
I wrote down the answers. Now I have 3 complete Mousewood jokes.
Does this kid know nothing?
Woohoo! Hello, Jerry. Well, where to? Our post office by the river is underwater. Let's go. Hang on tight, Jerry. See you later.
Did that frog just say it can't swim?
I've collected genuine Mousewood jokes.
Well then, good luck. And now, open it.
Hey, Jerry! Are we getting the nut again?
No, now it's...
We've got our feet.
Alright, well, why do bees hum?
No idea. Why do bees hum, Jerry?
Because they can't remember the words.
Good one. Oh!
Why do mice usually avoid drinking too much blue juice? Because the hangover gives them the blues.
Super! That kid's really good.
You'll love this one. A rabbit couple is booked on a luxury cruise. At the quay they get stopped because there are too many of them. Why?
Tell us. Come on!
Because with rabbits, 2 soon becomes a crowd.
Brilliant! But you can't tell it to just anybody. Oh, no.
Thank you, thank you.
Jerry, get off the stage. My junior has absorbed this new knowledge like a water rat. He's just as thrilled as the audience. I've hardly ever seen him this fired up about something, and the water trick never got this kind of reaction. Since you've made a great comedian out of Junior and brought me this much closer to my retirement, we'd be happy to give you the water rat. Right, Junior? Junior? Yes, he agrees. Take the water rat.
Terrific, thanks a lot.
You'll see, soon my junior will be a big star. And you can say, I knew him before he was famous.
I'm truly, honored.
Hi, sweetie. So slick. I still don't know what that is.
I don't want to waste the water enough on that.
Oh. That's only the flooded area, excuse me. Oh, the flood path, maybe?
I should do this during the day.
Why? What's the fucking difference?